Thank you, John. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. As I said, so I'm going to be talking a bit about the Little Rock Accord and why we're here this week to try and persuade people to take action on climate change, and in particular in the finance world. To give you a little bit of an idea of where I sit, I'm now an academic. I've been an academic for a long time, and as John just said, I started off as a cosmologist, which is about the least useful academic practice you can possibly have, but possibly the most interesting. And why climate change is so important an issue for me is that I want there to be cosmologists in 100 years' time. I want us to still be endeavouring to create knowledge, to understand how the world works, how the universe works. And climate change is one of those risks that potentially threatens our global economy, it threatens our business practice, and it threatens everything we do, so that we wouldn't be able to have universities and cosmologists in the future. So that's what really guides me in my work and the work that I've been doing over the last decade or so in climate change, and in particular the business policy interface. I now live and breathe in Anglia Ruskin University, which is the other university in Cambridge, sort of 6 doors down from where I used to work, running the Prince of Wales's leadership groups. And what we were trying to do is to get business to take positive action, to lobby governments and to enable and work with governments to come up with proactive solutions to climate change challenges, and wider than that. What I've been doing over the last year is focusing a bit more on some of those key barriers that have been identified by those leadership groups, and some of the things we'll be talking about here are around what are those barriers, why is climate change so important. So the presentation is sort of in 2 parts. The first part is how I present climate change and resources, the risks involved, to pension fund leaders. So these are the chief executive, chief financial officers who don't really know why this is an issue. So it's a sort of quick view of a simple, non-scientific view of why this is an important issue, followed by what the P8 is, why it is an important thing that we're trying to do here, and what the Little Rock Accord is all about. So why the Little Rock Accord? Just to start with, I thought I'd start with the sort of our definition of sustainability. So it's sort of climate change and slightly wider than that. And this is based on discussions with government leaders, with business leaders from around the world. It sort of builds on traditional definitions of sustainable development, but we're trying to focus on actually, rather than just development, what does actually being at sustainability mean? And the key words in there, you can sort of try and guess which sectors of society wanted particular words in there. So the just society, which manages full diversity of environmental risks, is the traditional definition of sustainable development. It's a society that operates for all. However, the innovation and opportunity part is a really important one when we're trying to engage governments and business. So it's not just about trying to ensure we have poverty alleviation and environmental management for the sake of it, but it's also around creating opportunities, creating business opportunities, creating innovation, creating entrepreneurship that allows people to thrive, that allows us to actually build this into our economy. So that's why we've got a just society of innovation, opportunity and well-being for society which manages the full diversity of environmental risks. So one of those interesting discussions that when we set up the P8 and set up ClimateWise, the insurance group, and we've set up a banking group similarly along those lines around 2-3 years ago, it was all around opportunity. It was all around how do we tackle something like climate change while still growing the economy. What's happened over the last 2 to 3 years are people are starting to talk about no growth. People are talking about stagnating economic growth. What does that then mean? How do we start talking about systemic risks to the whole economy? So the concept of limits to growth has been coming back, actually driven mainly from the finance sector rather than the government. So we're working a lot with financial risk analysis to think about how does a pension operate when economic growth, as they're used to, doesn't exist anymore or is severely curtailed in their traditional markets. So they're more open to having discussions around investing in developing countries, they're more open to having discussions about investing in alternative technologies, and they can also see new systemic risks which they didn't think existed before. They didn't think the entire global economy could be brought down by not thinking about risks in particular areas. But we've seen that we came dangerously close to bringing down the entire global economy, and certainly the financial sector part of it, fairly recently. So they're more opening to have those sorts of discussions. So the risks we face in the 21st century, climate change, lots of other environmental problems, especially biodiversity loss. There's oil depletion and other resource constraints that we face, mainly around pricing, which are mainly driven around human consumption, caused by population growth. This is global population growth, as well as economic growth. So we're doing more with the same planet. So how do we make sure that we've got what we need to have to continue that sort of development over the long term? So when we think about the resource constraints, and this is why we try and develop a systems view of this, so we can try and tackle climate change in its entirety by itself. We could try and tackle oil scarcity and increases in oil prices by itself. And interesting, I was in Chicago a couple of days ago talking to the Society of Actuaries, so financial risk modelers for the large pension funds, for the large insurers, and they say as a market we're fantastic at coping with things like oil price increasing and scarcity of oil prices. The problem we have is that that's also coming alongside food price increasing, drought, weather, Hurricane Sandy, climate change, water availability, land scarcity. We're not quite sure how all of these things are going to interact. We can't cope with that level of systemic risk. We need help to try and understand how to do that. The market's not very good at connecting everything together. So what we're trying to do increasingly with the finance sector is develop this sort of systems view of all of the interconnectedness around energy, food, water, land, commodities, including metals, social mobility, how the society interacts with all of these different resource constraints, and then environmental loading as a key and critical issue, which will hit over the short and long term. And within environmental loading, we include climate change. So the way we normally present to pension funds, business leaders, is to try and explain this in fairly simple terms, just to give them a way into the climate change discussions without having to really engage in detail with the climate models, because that gets very complicated very quickly. So I always start with a map of the world. And the good news story around the world and the global development that we've seen over the last century or so in particular, especially the investments we've seen in agriculture and in health and in poverty alleviation, economic growth has delivered a huge range of goods. So this is a map of the world. This is a map of the world distorted according to global population. So this is where people live on the planet. And you can see that in the US, you're about right according to your population. So per landmass, there's the right number of people. India and China are slightly overpopulated, as is Europe, according to the average population per landmass. Nobody lives really in Russia or Canada. No one lives in Australia. It's a desert. And the geographer that created this map thought lots of people lived in Antarctica, but they don't. So there are interesting dynamics about, basically we like living in a warm region which can grow food. So we live roughly in the middle of our planet, and that has its own challenges and its own issues. But this is what we've been able to do. We have 7 billion people on the planet. They're not all dying. There are severe poverty in areas, but we're able to sustain 7 billion people. Over the last 60 or so years, we've also been able to increase health, well-being, and food security for the majority of people on the planet. So our life expectancy has been going up fairly dramatically in some places. So you can see going from sort of the low 40s up to the mid 60s. On average, we're living to around 70 to 80 in most places in the world. The only exception to that is in sub-Saharan Africa, where the AIDS epidemic and other issues in sub-Saharan Africa have kept that curve low. But economic development around the planet has been very good for increasing our life expectancy, so we've been getting older. It's also been very good for reducing poverty, and this is the sort of World Bank figure of $1.25 a day as the sort of extreme poverty level. So this is a percentage of people living below that level. And you can see that for most countries that's been getting much better, for the developed world staying down, sort of dark blue line that comes down fairly sharply is mainly due to China's poverty drive. So China investing a lot in economic development and that taking a large percentage of people out of poverty. Again, sub-Saharan Africa, which is that line that stubbornly stays above 50%, but lots of development programs going on there. So we've been getting healthier, we've been getting wealthier, and that's what economic development has been doing for us over the last century. So it's been a good news story, and this is what most economists would talk about when they talk about economic growth delivering prosperity and well-being for most people. I'm an environmentalist, so I'll always then go on to the but. So while we've had economic development, we've also had other issues that come alongside the sort of economic development that we've seen. And here's some examples of some of those issues that we may be facing over the next few years, or already currently facing. This is the map of the world in the 2050s according to water availability per head of population. So this is a map of the world taking into account climate change as well as depletion of current water resources as well as population growth, showing where there will be either no stress in water, which is the grey, or extreme stress in water, which is the red. So in the red areas, there isn't enough water to sustain the population that's projected to be there in 2050. You can see that's the majority of the central part of the world, in particular in North Africa, in the Middle East, large parts of China, large parts of the US, especially some of the agricultural belt, also east of England in Europe, and southeast of Spain in Europe. So where we are in the east of England, in Cambridge, we're going to be facing severe water stress, which is mainly down to population growth and the development and the infrastructure and the industries that we're putting in place, where we already know there isn't enough water for the industries we currently have, but we're continuing to develop and build with the expectation that we'll be able to find water from somewhere. So how you manage these sorts of issues are very important, and then the additional stresses and strains that go along with development and with climate change is very important. It's not just water. This is the map of the world according to today for degradation of soils. So this is sort of agricultural story. So where we've over-farmed or have eroded soils. And you can see again, there are some severe areas, especially around in China, where the soil degradation is quite severe at the moment, and increasing in places in Europe, in Africa, in the US, and in Central America. Places are becoming more soil quality is going down. So what does that do to food productivity over the long term? When you put that on top of water availability, how will that impact on global food security, and then all the stresses that that brings along with it? We then also have global resource challenges, and this isn't really a question of running out of stuff, the peak oil type question. This is more a question of price of commodities. So what this curve is showing us is the number of years left. So the 150 years down to 50 years left at current prices. So at today's prices, this is what we could extract out of the planet. So you can see coal around 120 years left, oil just over 50 years left, indium, very important for the technology industry, about 20 years left. So there is a number of key things that we use to create economic development, to create economic growth, which are severely limited. We can go and find alternative technologies that don't need to use those sorts of resources, or we can find those resources in other areas, but they get more expensive. So as economic development continues, how do we cope with things that are getting more expensive? Food that's getting more expensive, water that's getting less available, and resources that are getting more expensive. On top of that, we then have environmental loading, which includes a number of different issues. So this is a plot from the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden. This was a Nature paper they published last year, trying to quantify the environmental loading. So how far are we loading the environment according to its sort of naturally reproducing cycle? So what you have here in the green circle in the middle is the planetary boundary. This is the planetary boundaries work, So it's where you could load the planet and it could cope with that loading. It has its own self-sustaining solutions. It recycles. It's able to keep ocean acidification cycles so that it doesn't disrupt ocean systems. So within the green, you're in the safe operating system. Beyond the green, you run the risk of hitting tipping points where the planet just runs away and it goes into a different state. So beyond the green, you're in a dangerous area where you could be kicking the planet into a different environmental state than you're used to operating in. What that environmental state means, we're not quite sure. How that translates into financial risk and economic risk is what we're trying to now understand. So what you have in the top is climate change. And you can see we're about 50% overloading the planet according to climate change. So there's 50% too much emissions loading the planet for climate change. That's where the 50% cut in emissions by 2050 comes from. The red bar down this side is the nitrogen cycle. So this is overloading soils, freshwater systems, mainly from fertilizers and our artificial use of nitrogen. So we're well overloading the system here. This is where soil degradation comes into it and everything like that. So we're hugely overloading the system from nitrogen. This red line down here, which goes way off the curve, is biodiversity loss. So we are in one of the great extinctions of the planet. About 95% of biodiversity is being lost. You've then got land system changes, global freshwater use, ozone depletion and ocean acidification. These two over here aren't quantified. They're very difficult to measure, so they're working on quantifying those, which is why there's no red bars in there. But you can see this is a mix of local and global issues. And it's also then interesting to try and translate what does this mean for the economy, what does this mean for financial sector. So climate change has more immediate economic impacts and more immediate finance impacts. Biodiversity loss, we're not quite sure what that means. So how you measure and quantify that and then do something about it is more difficult to understand. So to take a little bit more of a view on some of these issues, so are we really running out of resources? What does this actually mean? And how do we start to build an economic and financial model that allows us to make positive decisions about what we should be doing? We're trying to build a global database of all of these things, put them into a big systems model, link it into capital availability, people availability, labor productivity, and see what we can do when we implement different sorts of policies and different sorts of investment practices and different sorts of responses from government and business. So these are the sorts of data that we're now pulling together. This is the resource limits. This is the oil availability. So this is from a variety of sources. This one's from BP, showing that we peaked in the conventional oil in the last 10 years or so. In the last decade, we peaked in the availability of crude oil from conventional sources. We're now still discovering some conventional sources, but the majority of future oil availability is from unconventional sources, which is mainly slightly more expensive. It's certainly not going to be the traditional lows in cost for oil. So what does that do for economic growth? What does that do for future decisions around climate change? Coal is another interesting story, especially given the sort of switch from coal to gas. But this is just looking at coal globally and where coal is available and what sort of coal is available. So the red is the lower quality coal and the grey is high quality coal, the coal that we've been traditionally used to burning. So this is cheap energy from coal and this is slightly more expensive energy from coal. And you can sort of see globally we're now switching into a slightly more lower quality coal. So coal will become more expensive certainly over the next century, probably over the next few decades. And if we start to substitute oil for coal, liquefying it, then that will go down fairly rapidly. And in some countries it's worse than others. So the US, still quite a lot of higher quality coal left, but the majority is in low quality coal. Russia, it's mainly low quality coal. China, still more high quality coal. India, who is building lots of coal power stations, lots of high quality coal left. So there are interesting political and economic and geopolitics going on around coal. Gas is a similar sort of story. So globally, gas has been getting much more expensive, almost going up by a factor of 10 over the last 20 years, and the US coming down again by a factor of 4 because of shale gas. but still not down to the historic lows, around a doubling since the historic lows. So this is the sort of cost of production versus the resources available, and shale gas is in there. There are lots of other things you can do, Arctic, deep water, so lots of gas available, but it's generally more expensive than when we had that century-long economic development that delivered all the things that we almost took for granted, the increasing health and increasing reduction of poverty. So as the commodities we need to drive that growth get more expensive, how does that play out? And then thinking back the sort of land degradation again, what does that mean for the agricultural expansion that we've seen over the last century? So this is a plot of the Earth in 1700 versus a plot of the Earth in 2000, according to what the land is used for. So the dark browny colour is agricultural land, and the green is forests and grasslands. So basically, we didn't really use the world in 1700. We use a lot of the world now to grow our food and biofuels and other things. So there's not a lot of room left for expansion, apart from in Russia and Canada. And as things melt in Russia and Canada, there are also new opportunities there. The other thing around resource limits is also thinking about how you're spending your capital and the other opportunities. So this is just a plot of the metals and ore quality. So there's a sort of general trend of reducing ore quality. This is mainly Australia, Canada, and the US for copper, nickel. And you can have similar plots for most resources. So the ore quality of metals is going down. The cost of metals is therefore going up slightly. The energy input is getting more expensive. And you need more of the ore to be able to extract the same amount of metal. We're doing a lot more recycling, which is becoming more economical because metals are becoming more expensive. The other thing that's getting increasingly more expensive globally is capital and money. And so this is a plot of the Earth collapsed according to debt versus foreign assets. So if tomorrow we said all the resources are more expensive, there's not enough land to grow all the food, let's switch off all foreign investments and debt, and then you just have to buy up what you need to protect your population. The two places you wouldn't want to be in are the US and Europe, who owe the rest of the world an awful lot of money. So this is the US around minus a few trillion, and Europe a few trillion in debt. China around 2.5 trillion positive. Can afford to buy up a lot of the resources. So there's interesting geopolitics and debt and economic growth and how you fuel economic growth, which comes into play into this. And trying to also incorporate that sort of government spending, public spending, but also the private spending and how it's spent into this sort of systems view of how the world works is really important for our modelling with pension funds and investment asset owners, so they can try and understand where these systemic risks to the global economy are, and how this then plays out into who can actually afford to buy things and how they buy things. The other thing which is going to peak as a resource over the next century is people, and depending on which data source and how quickly you think the world is going to urbanize, then the peak of population will happen somewhere between 2040 and 2070. One of the latest projections, taking into account urbanization, actually has a peak of population around 8 billion by 2040. The World Bank and the UN is more around 9 billion by 2050. But they haven't calculated the sort of scale of urbanization. If that continues, then it may peak slightly lower than that. So what happens to a world where population has peaked and then comes down slowly towards the end of the century is also interesting when you look at economic growth, returns on investment, gross labour productivity over the sort of second half of the century, when you're thinking of long-term returns to pensions, which are intimately tied to GDP and GDP growth. So how all of that plays out is very interesting. So this is just a plot of fertility rates globally coming down to about 2. In most developed countries, it's much below 2. So obviously climate change then just makes it all worse. So this is the sort of doom part of the presentation. So this is a map of the world distorted according to anthropogenic emissions. So this is mainly a measure of industrial output from large industry and energy sources. It doesn't include rainforests, otherwise Latin America would be much bigger. But you can see, according to the global map, China and the US are the two dominant sources. Europe is fairly big. Africa basically disappears apart from South Africa. Australia starts to reappear. Russia and Canada start to reappear. So per head and per capita, which is what the developing world focus on, then Canada and Russia and Australia are fairly large compared to how many people live there. The US is fairly large compared to how many people live there. China is around right compared to its population. India's a bit small. Africa's tiny. And again, we're not quite sure where all the coal power stations are in Antarctica, but we'll talk to the GIS person. Climate change has these interesting dynamics and tipping points, and thinking back to that sort of plot around environmental loading, what does a tipping point in the climate system actually mean? Why do we try and focus on climate change as an urgent issue when most of the impacts from climate change are going to be more long-term? Although when you have tropical storms hitting New York causing $60 billion worth of damage, then they can be more short-term, and droughts in the US having potential implications for global food security over the next couple of years, then again it can be very short-term. But the impacts that you've seen in the US and in Europe over the last decade, magnify those up by a factor of 10 globally, and you get the sort of impacts people are projecting towards the end of the century. And if any of these tipping points we go over these, then that's runaway climate change, which is very difficult to do anything about, and that could have huge implications for global society, how we manage global society and the global economy. There's lots of different things in here. The ones that are increasingly worrying are permafrost and methane melting in the Northern Hemisphere, because we're already measuring that happening. So whether we've already gone beyond the tipping point or not, we're not quite sure. But if that is going beyond the tipping point, then this is a huge scale adaptation project that we're also talking about, as well as mitigating. So what we want to try and do is avoid going over some of those tipping points and trying to encourage a sort of new view of the economy that can manage resource limits as well as climate change limits over the long term. And especially, seeing as I'm in the US, I like to quote Jay Leno, but this was a few years old. But according to a new UN report, global warming outlook is much worse than originally predicted, which is pretty bad when they originally predicted it was destroy the planet. And I think this is an interesting dynamic in the climate change negotiations. And when we talk to pension funds and governments, and I think it was yesterday that the new science report, the new IPCC report, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was leaked. And it's on the web if everyone wants to read it. I skimmed through the summary for Policymakers, which basically says, yeah, it's the same as we said a few years ago, except we're now slightly more certain, and here are a few more of the impacts. The first report and some of the first things around climate change didn't quite say it would destroy the planet, but it's certainly a significant impact on society. And climate models, and I have nice discussions with climate modelers, and being a mathematical scientist, I enjoy doing climate models, but we do sometimes sort of say, wouldn't the money be better spent on actually solving the problem than just modeling it? We know it's bad enough already. We don't need to do any more modeling to say, really it's going to be much worse than we think it's going to be. But we'll be able to do a lot more projections about exactly what this impact means for local regions, for national areas, for different parts of the world, and trying to understand that and how that impacts on the economy may spur some action. But basically there's enough science out there to say this is a serious issue that we should be doing something about, and it's urgent, and we should be doing something about it now. And we've got the constraints of resource depleting, and things getting more expensive over the next few decades. So how we tackle those twin things together is very important. Seeing as we're in Club de Madrid, I almost deleted this slide because it's a Club of Rome slide. But in 1972, this was the Limits to Growth report, which I think just sort of summarized the response to this. About 90% of people on the planet who read it thought it was completely rubbish and wasn't what was going to happen at all. But basically what the group of 4 people at MIT did on behalf of the Club of Rome was to try and project this sort of systems view forward. So taking current economic development to come up with a few scenarios, and they came up with 12 scenarios for what our current use of resources would do to the planet. They didn't include climate change in 1972. They didn't have sophisticated climate models. It was one of the first real computer models that they used to create this sort of systems view. And why was this an important issue, and why is this still interesting? We're actually working with Jürgen Randers, who is one of the PhD students who was working on this report at the time. And Jürgen's been addressing, he came and talked to the P8 group of pension funds to talk about these sorts of issues. What they were trying to do is looking at food, services, the industrial output, so the things we measure within our economy, the things that are important to global society. So this was their business as usual scenario. We don't really do very much about it. We just project forward the current use from 1972, which is there, to the end of this century, 2100. What happened with the limits to growth, it got a lot of media coverage. It wasn't well reported in the media. No surprises there. But their projection always, this was their central projection. So you can see the sort of curves going up and down. This is their population curve in black. This is the services per capita, the non-renewable resources, so this is the resource depletion. What this sort of grey outline is when they wrote the report and to 2000, and what they've done, this is a group in Australia, is to actually plot what actually happened to the services over that timescale. So these dark lines is what has actually happened, and you can see it's a pretty good fit. We've been slightly more efficient with resources, so there's a few more left. Population has grown slightly faster because we've been better at healthcare than they projected. But in general, we're pretty much on track. We've had a little bit more food availability. But then you sort of look forward over the next 40 years, and their projections forward are that things start to turn a bit nasty around 2030, and by the middle of the century, and their projections by the middle of the century, was that the population starts to decline. Now, there's a number of reasons for the population starting to decline. Our fertility is going down, so we're aging population, so it would naturally decline. And if you just run those models by the end of the century, we'll be back to where we are now, just by natural population trends. However, this is going from a peak of about 8 to 9 billion down to 4 billion by the end of the century. So that's half of the population of the world starving to death. What that means for geopolitics and economic development, and that doesn't include climate change, is fairly significant, depending on who you are in the world. Whether that projection turns out to be true, we'll wait and see. Jürgen's just written a new book, 2052, which tries to project forward to 2052, and basically comes up with a similar sort of projection, and he stops before the collapse. And actually, he's very honest, and he says the reason he stops just there is because he'll be dead in 2030. That's his life expectancy. So he wants to optimize his pension. So to optimize your pension, you need to know roughly what your returns are going to be like 20 years after you die, because that will affect your returns. So he wants to know roughly how to optimize the rest of his life, because he spent most of his life trying to campaign for this sort of thing. But what happens towards the end of the century, and as things like climate change start to impact into this, then it'll be interesting to see whether these projections hold true, or how we can deviate from this. And it's the deviation from this that we are here in Little Rock to talk about. And this is actually from Hunter Lovin's. So this is a sort of curve of, are we on a sixth wave of innovation? How can we create the opportunities and the innovation and the well-being that can tackle the twin challenges of things getting more expensive and climate change impacts coming to hit us? So this is our sort of sixth wave of innovation. You can argue whether there have been 1, 2, 3, or 4 waves before that. But sustainability, green chemistry, industrial ecology, renewable energy, how do we create the space that allows this sort of new wave of innovation and opportunity to happen? It's happening slowly. It's not happening at the sort of scale and speed of urgency that's needed to try and avert some of those tipping points. But this is sort of plots of clean energy investing and generating capacity investment. So this is fossil fuels. And actually, in the last couple of years, this is now passed. So there's now more investment going into clean energy than into fossil fuels. Of course, there is a lot more capacity already there in fossil fuels. So the actual percentage of capacity in clean energy is much lower. But the actual investment is now catching up. So clean energy is a new market, which is on a par with fossil fuels. This is just another way of looking at the same sort of plot and where the investments are going. So this is Bloomberg data, looking at the sort of G20 countries and the non-G20 countries, investments in clean energy going up to $200 billion per year. So something's happening. We need to speed up this sort of transition and this investment. So what are the sort of things we're trying to talk about with the investments companies is to look at those risks and to incorporate those risks into their decision-making processes, which makes it then easier for them to unlock and invest in the opportunities. Because at the moment, they're not measuring the risks really. Then they don't have the metrics to be able to understand how to put these risks into their balance sheets and how to make decisions based on them. So we need to try and help them to do that while opening up the opportunities for creating these new investments, for helping them understand where those investments are, and showing them it's possible, creating some of the early investments that mean that this can happen and they can then go to scale. So the key areas of risk that we talk about with the investors, and this is when they look at climate change investing, the sort of investments, some of these are common across all types of investments. Certainly the physical risks to infrastructure investing is becoming more important, and things like Sandy helps to articulate the types of risks they face, but the sort of physical risk to their infrastructure investing, where they're building them. Certainly in the UK, lots of discussions around building on floodplains currently. We're very good at building in places that we really shouldn't be building and not protecting those assets. Importantly, for climate change investing, the policy risk is a really important one, and this is something that why we really want to try and bring investors and governments together to talk about climate investing. That's the really key issue, is around policy risk. So governments will often say, why aren't investors just putting loads of money into clean energy? And the investors are saying, well, governments don't believe this is a really important issue because they're not putting any policy in place, so we won't invest. So we want to try and get them together so that governments can understand that we need things like carbon pricing, energy regulations, some subsidies for some of the early stage technologies to be able to get them off the drawing board, get them out into the market and demonstrate what's possible. While a market is being created, then there are issues around the market risk, and this is mainly around just not enough projects out there. We don't understand how to do this. We haven't had the experience. If we build a very large wind farm offshore in the UK, and then that operates really fantastically, and we take all the money out, we haven't got another one to invest in. There just isn't enough projects out there. So there's this sort of deal flow issues. There's also then just currency issues. So most of the projects, or a lot of the projects, are all over the world. So how you then manage the political risk and the currency risk associated with investing in different countries is also important. And security is becoming increasingly important, and this has always been the case in energy infrastructure in particular, but just things happening on the ground in particular countries, meaning your assets are more at risk from security issues. So how you measure that, especially as resources become more scarce. And we've already seen this in particular in water, where water is a key issue for use in energy, for use in products, as well as for local communities. So riots around water issues and food. So the finance sector barriers on the supply side, this is sort of what the pension funds see. So this is what I've been saying around lack of diversification. They don't see the projects that they can invest in. They don't see the institutional credibility. They don't see the longevity of projects. There aren't that many companies out there that have been doing this for decades, as there are in other energy projects. And there's not enough scale and there's not enough monitoring. They don't know if when they've made an investment into something, it's actually going to have the impact they want it to have. So those are the sorts of things that the pension funds and the investors start to talk about on the demand side, on the people creating the projects. Then there's a lack of understanding of the issue from the people that are giving them their money. They're not quite sure what the pension funds are asking them. They're not getting very clear messages around we want you to have climate change impacts or economic return or a mix of both. What sort of mix, how far can we go on climate versus economic return? And there's a lack of clear mandates that fix into that. And the unrealistic return targets, pension funds aren't quite sure what they do, so they want really high returns. You don't get those sorts of returns very often. You do occasionally. But how you get very double-digit returns in some projects are very uncertain. So understanding of what you're investing in and why you're investing in. And then the external factors around uncertain policy environment and very cumbersome and complex international policy, which most pension funds and investors don't have the time to be able to engage with. So what we need to be able to do, and what we're here in Little Rock to try and further, is that partnership and cooperation between the public and private, getting governments and the private sector to talk together and to get them to also invest and create some of the early stage opportunities that can then go to scale. So creating some of those initial projects that can demonstrate what's possible and demonstrate the sorts of things that we want to see more of in the future. We need small and large-scale changes. We need $100 million projects, and we need very small projects that can then aggregate up. We need behavior change, we need technology change, we need infrastructure change. All of it needs substantial financing. So we need to be able to bring all of the money to the table to be able to get to the sort of change that's required. To give you some examples of good and bad policy, so this is where the private sector have been talking to the public sector. So this is the UK example of feed-in tariffs to try and increase and create a solar industry in the UK. So a feed-in tariff was created in early 2010 to incentivize solar PV installations across the whole of the UK. In some regions, there was a 4,000% increase in solar installations over a year. So that created a solar industry from nothing. And so by the middle of last year, there was a solar industry in the UK where there wasn't before. The UK government then realised they couldn't afford that, decided to retrospectively change the feed-in tariff, and destroyed the solar industry in a month. So it's also very important that the public sector, while creating some of these incentives, knows why it's creating those incentives. So if it's creating an incentive to create an industry, it's fantastic. If it's creating an industry to have a climate impact, it's not great when they becomes unaffordable. And the problem, those two weren't connected. So it wasn't about job creation. It wasn't about creating an industry. It was more about the climate targets, and it was in the wrong department in government to be able to then say, actually, we've got all these jobs that we can't now lose. Or they should have had a better discussion with the public sector about how much returns they want. People were making 10% returns on investment, which was much higher than you get in anything else. So people were just throwing money at it, which is why it became very unaffordable. You don't need to make that much money, certainly not in the UK. So there's something about getting the policy right so you don't undermine investor confidence. Investor confidence in solar and in feed-in tariffs in general, certainly in Europe now, is not very high. So new feed-in tariffs have to be really high to get investors to put money into it, because Spain did the same, the Czech Republic did the same, then the UK did the same. So it undermines confidence. Where some countries have had better reputations with this. The China wind deployment, putting in feed-in tariffs. China's got slightly more money and wants to create an industry that then exports, so they're doing it for a different sort of reason. So they're able to follow through that sort of exponential growth of industry and output and continue to support that until it doesn't need support any further. So that's the sort of wind deployment in China. But basically we're talking about billions of dollars of investment that's required across a range of different sectors. So it isn't possible for governments to underwrite all of these investments. It's not a case of subsidies to try and create all of these sorts of investments. It's a case of trying to analyse each of these sectors and understand what the private sector can do best and what the public sector can do best. So this is just a plot, according to the United Nations, of the types of investment in mitigation, so mainly stopping the emissions going into the atmosphere. Energy supply, this is energy research and development, industry, buildings, waste, road vehicles, agriculture, forestry. So it's a range of different issues that need mitigation investment. It's also a range of different issues that now need adaptation investment, and this is growing as climate change, as we start to not do as much on mitigation. The majority of adaptation investment is around infrastructure, including residential. This is global investment, but also agriculture, fishery, forestry. So lots of investment both on the mitigation and adaptation side is needed. It's much easier to make money from the mitigation side, but increasingly private sector is getting interested in infrastructure investment. They do infrastructure investment anyway. They want to protect their assets, but also agriculture and fishery investment. So how we do that sort of thing is very important. One alternative solution which certainly the pension funds are interested in, and I suppose this is one thing I wanted to put up just as this possibly isn't the right way of solving the climate issue, is to buy up land globally. So this is just plots of, in the sort of circles, which countries are then buying up the land, the productive land of other countries. They're doing lots of good things. So China is buying a lot of land in Africa and across the Middle East and in Latin America, and putting in a lot of development programs alongside buying that land. But when food prices go up and food security becomes an issue, what happens to the ownership rights of that land will be really interesting over the next century or so. As food becomes more scarce or certainly more expensive, how ownership rights are played out will become really interesting within the geopolitics, and especially when China's buying up large swathes of Australia, more investment coming into the US. It'll be really interesting to see how we respond to that from a legal point of view. So the sorts of investment we're talking about, 30 billion to be mobilized in the last couple of years for investments into developing country investments, and around 100 billion a year by 2020. This is the United Nations agreement that all countries have signed up to by 2020, so mobilizing 100 billion per year by 2020. And this is investments into developing countries. The developing countries will say that's all aid and grant money. The developed countries will say that's all private sector capital, that's investments and we want returns on it. So that's, to simplify the international negotiations, the hub of the problem. So there's the sort of loss and damage type equation and question around whether that's an investment into infrastructure and an investment that includes private sector capital, or whether that's grant aid. It's certainly not going to be grant aid. The developed country can't afford to do that. So it'll be a mix. The World Bank estimate about 85% of that needs to come from the private sector, so we're trying to understand how you encourage 85% of the private sector of that, so 85 billion a year, to be invested into developing countries, as well as the billions that need to be invested into developed countries at the same time. So just to summarize the sort of P8 journey and what the P8 was. So the P8 is a sort of loose collection of pension funds, and this is similar to the banking group that we set up in the ClimateWise, the insurance group, although the insurance group actually have a set of principles that they report against every year. But the P8 summits hosted in London, Washington, and Brussels, and this was a small group of very large public pension funds. The average size is around $200 billion. CalPERS, CalSTRS, and New York State from the US. But basically the aim of the P8 group is to build on existing activities in the area of climate change by bringing together global representation from the sector to help catalyse opportunities for further investment and to support removal of barriers to large-scale capital deployment. It's basically the ability of someone like the Prince of Wales to host and to bring together the chief executives and the chief financial officers and the chief risk officers of some of the large pension funds, so the decision makers, with government people at the very senior level, into a room and have a discussion about some of these key strategic risks and barriers. So if you can have a room of 20 people sitting around in a palace, and that's why they turn up, and they collectively steward $3 trillion and the policies that are needed to unlock that, we hope you can do quite a lot with that. So that was the whole concept behind the P8, was to try and bring together that $3 trillion of investment with the people that can help incentivize it and do something about it. That's one of the rooms. I think there's slightly more than 20 people in there. But that was one of that's in the Prince of Wales's home in Clarence House. So he hosts the meetings in London. The World Bank hosted one in Washington. And actually it was the US Embassy that hosted the one in Brussels. One of the things we wanted to do, because obviously within that mission statement it says to build on their existing activities, so we wanted to understand their existing activities as pension funds. What do they already do in climate change? What is policy driving them to do already? So what is the current policy framework enabling them to do? So we were able to ask around half of the pension funds who were in the P8 what their investment strategies were. Some of the countries were slightly less open with exactly what they were investing in, or don't produce the sort of corporate reports that CalPERS and CalSTRS do. Certainly the China Investment Corporation are slightly more open with some of their investments than they are with others. They don't have a corporate report. So it was easier to do some of this. But basically the total funds invested then is about half of the P8, so it's about $1.3 trillion. Their climate, and this is what they class as climate solutions investing, was around $7.5 billion, which is just over 0.5% of their total fund of investment. And this was some of the most progressive pension funds. These are the large pension funds that should be, that are exposed to these sorts of systemic risk. We also looked at what that fund investment was, and this included forests in Canada, which were basically producing paper, but because they were forests, we could count them as climate change. So there's a huge range of things that go into this. It is going up slightly, and that is still a not insignificant amount of money. But what we were trying to talk to them is, how does this become a standard asset class? How does this become something in which 10% of your assets could be classed as climate investment? And how does it become something which is actually incorporated across your entire strategy? So that's what we're trying to encourage them to do, and that's why we need the policymakers to say, actually, your current policies are making them do this. So those are the P8 Summit attendees. These are the funds that came, just to give you a sort of idea of the breadth and range. So they're from all over the world, apart from Africa and the Middle East, although some of the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds are fairly interested in these sorts of discussions, are increasingly interested in this, especially on the agricultural side. So what the P8 did, and this is the sort of P8 process, just to summarize this very quickly, basically on the left-hand side, as you're looking at it, is international policy negotiations and engagement with some of the other groups within the investment community that try and make these big policy proclamations. We need more policy, we need more interventionist policy. And then on this side is the deal and vehicle creation. So getting them to sit down with the World Bank, with the USAID, with the UK Department for International Development to create new opportunities that can demonstrate what is possible if people actually just got round the table and talked strategically about this. So this is the sort of deal and vehicle creation that underpins then the calls for policy and influencing that they want. So just examples, and you can find these on the web, of some of the outputs. So this was some of the things they were doing with looking at their own asset allocation, so how they make internal decisions with some of their own advisors. So this was Mercer and the International Finance Corporation looking at how pension funds make decisions. The policy engagement coming up with policy recommendations to the United Nations, and then getting each of the regional groups to engage with their respective governments. So the INCR is the Institutional Network on Climate Risk, which is a US-based group in Washington, and trying to invest and develop the research that's needed to develop this sort of policy and develop these sorts of opportunities. This is the 2009 investor statement that went to Copenhagen, which is just sets and outlines the sorts of things the investors needed out of a global deal. And that's Jack Ennis from CalSTRS handing it over to the UN Secretary General, just basically saying, you know, the pension funds want you to do something, want you to agree to an international policy on climate change, otherwise we can't make investments, and we think we can make money out of these investments if you just set something in place. What this then led to was obviously having that small group of pension funds with a large amount of capital is very important, but obviously there's many more pension funds, some of whom are able to move more quickly than others. So we tried to expand this, and we hosted a meeting in Seoul, hosted by the National Pension Service in Korea. So this was the P80 Pensions Summit in 2010, which brought in a lot more of the Asian pension funds and focused on Asian investment and some of the climate things that we could do there, which made it slightly more tractable. But the, basically splitting this into two things, looking at the political process and then also focusing on, let's try and create some projects in Asia. Let's try and get some projects off the ground that can demonstrate what is possible and how we can take this forward in more detail. And for those of you that are attending some of the Club de Madrid meetings, we'll be talking a lot more about some of the things that came out of the Asia Summit, in particular the CP3 fund, which is one of the things that came out of the P8 meetings alongside the UK government, the Asia Development Bank and the International Finance Corporation. So the CP3 fund, which is Climate Public-Private Partnership, and this is taken from the UK government, so the Asia Development Bank and the International Finance Corporation have their own way of describing this, but this is the UK government way. So the UK government has committed £130 million to try and underpin private sector investment, to invest alongside the private sector into Asia and infrastructure funds globally. So alongside the Asia Development Bank, trying to create a sort of fund of funds type structure that invests in infrastructure. So the UK government is taking a stake in this. They're not doing it as grant aid. They're just investing alongside the pension funds to try and show that actually the risk isn't there, otherwise the UK government wouldn't be taking that risk. The International Finance Corporation is doing something more globally to try and get more early stage projects off the ground. And alongside that, the UK government's also putting in 20 million to try and do technical assistance to help the countries that deploy this sort of project develop the capacity to develop the policies needed to underpin those projects. So that's why working between the sort of private sector arm, creating a $2 billion fund with a public sector who can then help to create the right sort of environments that attract this sort of investment is really important. So those are the sort of public-private partnerships that we want the P80 to go forward and do more of. So that's what we're now trying to do in Little Rock, is take the P80 mindset, bringing really large capital holders together with the governments and the policymakers and the project developers in these countries to say, actually, why aren't these things happening? How can we create them to happen? It's about convening. It's about getting the right people in the right place at the right time. And that's what the Little Rock Accord will try and do, is commit some of the Club de Madrid members to use their convening power to be able to pull their respective stakeholders together to create more of these sorts of opportunities. Because the Prince of Wales likes to start these things off, but obviously he has sort of a day job and will become increasingly busy as time goes on. So the more of these sorts of conveners that we can bring to the table, the more important it is. And that's what we hope that Little Rock and the meeting of Club de Madrid will be able to do going forward over the next couple of years and beyond. So I'll leave it there and say thank you for your attention.
Any questions? Anybody have any questions? It's a great presentation. Alan, thank you very much for being with us, and we're honored to have you here, and we'll see you around at Club de Madrid for the next couple of days. Thank you all for coming.